Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today, we will hear the presentation, Planning, Preservation, and Change, Preservation, an Effective Planning Tool. For questions related to the presentation, just type those in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end during the designated Q&A. If you have any technical issues too, you can type those in the Q&A box. I will do my best to try to help you through whatever those tech issues are. On your screen is a list of our APA sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. So thanks for joining us every year and for hosting today's very popular session. Upcoming webcasts, we have one more that you're able to register for right now. That's going to be coming up on June 9th. Our summer series is on the way. We have just about every Friday booked, and we'll be getting registration live here shortly. You can register for this webcast and then all of our upcoming webcasts at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. For those looking for AICP CM credits, this session has been approved for 1.5 credits. So to log them, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register, and also a weekly reminder of what's on tap for Friday. We record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to our channel. Just head over to YouTube and search in Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up along with our well over 400 recordings, all these sessions available for free. So again, type your questions in that Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end during the Q&A. And I now am going to turn things over. Let me stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to turn it over to Brad to kick things off. Let me get rid of this. All right, Brad.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brad Wolf. I am with the Urban Design and Preservation Division of the American Planning Association. Let me just bring this up. This is the second part of our series, Planning, Preservation, and Change. The first part was hosted by the National Trust, our partner in this series, and we will post the link to that first series if you weren't able to attend that. Really, this series started out as a recognition that planners and preservationists have a lot to learn from each other. We started working with the National Trust to think of ways we could, the American Planning Association and the National Trust could work together on projects. And this kind of goes to a long history where preservationists and planners were not necessarily in sync with each other in the early days of urban renewal. Preservationists were the activists that protested the loss of historic buildings to the visions of city planners. But today, historic preservation is really seen as an integral component of any comprehensive plan. So we started, even though this is more common today, there's still room to improve. And so we're thinking of ways to work with the National Trust to promote preservation and planning. And I encourage you to join if you're not part of our Urban Design and Preservation Division and have an interest in one of those two topics. I encourage you to join us. You can just go to the planning website, planning.org, and sign up for our division. And you don't necessarily have to be a member. You can be just an affiliate member, slightly different cost to that. And also, I encourage you to join the National Trust. There are a great number of resources and educational programs for preservation, and their website is preservationnation.org. And just to reiterate before we get started, we have a few logistical items. She mentioned earlier, the Q&A function is how we'll take questions at the bottom, and submit them at any point. We'll also post some links. One would be to the YouTube channel that have our previous series. I welcome you and we'll get started. So let me introduce our moderator today for our panel, Jim Lindberg. He's the Senior Policy Director at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He has more than 30 years experience in preservation planning and sustainable development, including 5 years as the Director of the National Trust for Preservation Green Lab. Thank you, and we will get started. Jim.
Okay, thanks so much, Brad. Welcome, everyone. Delighted we have a big group with us today, and really pleased to have you join us for this discussion. And we're going to look forward to your comments and questions as well. And first, I want to start by just seconding Brad's comments. Great to be working with APA and the Urban Design and Preservation Division to provide these learning opportunities and new resources across our related fields. I think as Brad said, I think there's a long history between preservation and planning. I think the connections are stronger than ever. And I think also now that the needs and the opportunities to work together to collaborate are stronger than ever, urgent even, as so many communities are facing challenges from affordable housing and equitable development and climate change that really need creative approaches and cross-disciplinary approaches. So we're gonna have, I think, a great discussion here today, hearing from 3 preservation practitioners about how their work is intersecting with planning, and get their thoughts on ways that we can strengthen the connections and collaborations between historic preservation and broader planning work. We've got 3 excellent panelists who are working in different regions of the country and at 3 different levels of government. And their full bios are available on the APA CM credit page if you want to dig into those. But I'll just briefly introduce them, and then we're going to hear a little bit from each of them about their roles and where they fit in their government programs, respectively. So first we have at the city level, Shannon Shea Miller, who directs the Office of Historic Preservation in San Antonio, where she's been since 2008. And we look to San Antonio for innovation constantly, and Shannon's always pushing the envelope, developing innovative programs that you'll be hearing a little bit more about, from Legacy Business Initiative to a new deconstruction ordinance. So we're delighted to have Shannon with us to talk about preservation at the city level. And then jumping up to the county level, pleased as well to have Sarah Cody and her assistant with us. Sarah is at Miami-Dade County in Florida, where she's the chief historic preservation chief there, and she's been focusing in particular on strategies for effective public engagement, equity and inclusion, housing affordability, and climate resilience. So great topics we'll hear more about from Sarah. And then finally, at the state level, delighted to have Larry Lucas with us from Colorado, which actually is where I'm based as well on a cloudy day here. Larry is the architect for the Colorado Main Street program, which is housed in state government at the Department of Local Affairs. And among other things, Larry's been developing some innovative work to provide a new incentive to connect historic preservation and environmental sustainability. So our structure here is we're going to hear, have a few questions and hear from our panelists, explore these connections between historic preservation and planning. And then we're definitely going to leave a good bit of time here at the top of the hour to hear from all of you. And so as questions come to you, please add those to the Q&A and we'll track those. And Christine will share those and we'll get comments back from our expert panelists. But first, before we get into this discussion, I thought it'd be good to hear a little bit about all of you. So we have the first of what will be 3 polling questions that I'd like Christine to launch. There you go. So just tell us a little bit about the connections between your work and historic preservation. So you've got a few choices there.
Give it another second.
Great.
Okay, it's slowing down now. I'm gonna go ahead and end it and share the results.
Okay, pretty good range. So perhaps the majority of you don't have a regular focus on preservation. That's just fine. We're delighted to have you with us. And then some of you are quite active. So excellent. Good to see that range. So again, we'll have a couple more questions to dig a little further into some of the issues that you're dealing with in your communities as we get through the session. But let's start, if we could, with some just introductory comments from each of the panelists. Just tell us a little bit about where you fit in your government structure and the key roles that you lead through your programs. And if I could, I'd like to start with Shannon at the city level.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So the Office of Historic Preservation in San Antonio is actually a standalone department. I think in many cities, the preservation function is often within the planning department or in some other development services type of department. In our case, it is a standalone department, which having worked in other cities where it was in the more traditional locations, I found that to be very helpful. Because being a peer with other department directors like the planning director means that, I have a seat at the table when decisions are being made at the city manager's office level, reporting directly to the city manager. So in my experience, that has been really helpful. The Office of Historic Preservation also does a lot of work beyond what is traditional, like just design review and the regulatory side of preservation. We have a very extensive education and outreach aspect to our program. And we also manage the city's vacant building program, which applies to historic properties in the downtown central business district, but it's not pure preservation only. You mentioned at the outset our new deconstruction ordinance that was approved by council. There are a few cities in the U.S. obviously that have deconstruction ordinances, but ours is the first that was done with a preservation lens. And that is tied to our circular economy program and to our Living Heritage Trades Academy, which is another really important aspect of our program. I think I'll stop there for the time being, just to keep it high level, but those are a few things I wanted to touch on.
Thanks, Shannon. And let me just confirm, so being a separate independent department, would you work with and are in touch with colleagues around the country, would you say that's fairly unusual?
Yeah, we have a network of the historic preservation officers in the top 21 cities population wise. And I think even among that group, it's not the norm. But there are a few, of the really large cities, I think, Chicago is not standalone, but New York is. And so there are a couple others, but I think it's fairly unusual.
It's less common. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Sarah, tell us a little bit about Miami-Dade.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So our office, the Miami-Dade County Office of Historic Preservation, we are housed within the planning division within our regulatory and economic resources department. But what I think is very interesting is our jurisdiction. So in Miami-Dade, in terms of historic preservation and archaeology, we have jurisdiction countywide. So over all the unincorporated areas and in the municipalities, unless a municipality decides to opt out and establish their own preservation ordinance and board. So right now, my office has jurisdiction over, like I said, the unincorporated areas and over 24 of our 34 municipalities for historic preservation jurisdiction. And then for archaeological jurisdiction, we actually have jurisdiction over 33 out of 34 of the municipalities. So it's a really big jurisdiction, and it involves a lot of coordination with not just county agencies, but with municipal agencies. And then we also have oversight over the 10 municipal programs that have opted out, because we set the minimum standards for their ordinances and operations that they're required to follow. And we have some compliance provisions if they don't follow the minimum standards.
Okay.
And, I just want to close by saying, I think our primary role, aside from acting as a model for historic preservation in South Florida, our primary role, as I see it, is to utilize the power of our historic and cultural resources to help our communities become more resilient and more equitable.
Great. Okay. We'll hear more about that.
Thank you.
in a little bit. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, and then finally, at the state level, Larry, tell us a little bit about your work there. And I'll just say, you know, obviously, as many of you probably know, there are state historic preservation offices in every state, and they are often housed in a variety of other departments. Could be standalone as well. Larry is working with our Main Street program in Colorado, and there are Main Street programs around the country. So Larry, tell us of how you fit in and your key role there.
Sure, thanks, Jim. Well, first off, Main Street is a national movement. It was actually funded by or established by the National Trust in the early 80s. And really, Main Street's about preservation and economic development working together to revitalize downtown areas, usually in rural communities. Currently, there are 45 coordinating programs across the state, which Colorado is one of. We are located in the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. So we work with local governments across the state. Main Street is something that you kind of have to opt into as a community. We currently have MOUs from the Department of Local Affairs with the community or the town in 25 officially designated programs. We offer tech support, resources, as well as grant funding. That anything that can lead to downtown revitalization is where we work. And we work closely with the Main Street Board, volunteers, and also the community government. We also have 66 affiliated communities that we offer some outreach activities to until they're ready to move up to the program. My position is I'm a licensed architect in Colorado, and I actually serve Main Street communities where I may work one-on-one with private property owners or local governments for their buildings, facilities, and also downtown public improvements and planning efforts. So it's a pretty a wide array of things that we do focus on. Not all Main Street programs across the country have an architect. So it's great, you know, because historic preservation is such a big component of Main Street.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, we'll hear more. Okay, excellent. Great to have that representation from the Main Street network and the Main Street movement, which has been so impactful around the country. All right, so I want to sort of get directly at this question of the connections between historic preservation and planning. And if I could, again, and with this question, I'm going to go around and give each of you a chance to respond and ask you for quick thoughts on how you think preservation and planning are aligning well in your experience. And then if there are some conflicts, let's hear about those too. So what's working, what's not working when we think about preservation and planning. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit and maybe ask Sarah if you would, well, are you able to, you're busy. Are you able to, I'll go ahead and ask.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Tiny assistance,
Sure.
not happy. You know, it's interesting. I think I'm going to start by saying kind of the biggest conflict, which I also think is the biggest opportunity for better alignment, is really policy objectives between historic preservation and planning and zoning. So, you know, I'm going to give an example that we have here in Miami-Dade. You know, we're continually looking to build more, increase density, increase housing. And so the county has basically incentivized upzoning along a lot of our transit corridors. And then they have buffers that extend out, and it kind of tapers down the upzoning, but it's still significantly higher than the neighborhood that's there. And those buffer zones extend a half mile beyond the transit corridor into the neighborhood. So for example, we have one that goes through a neighborhood called Brownsville, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And so where, you know, you have a lot of community members looking to preserve the character of the community, but then you have the county coming in with these policies saying, hey, we need more density around the transit and upzoning all that. And really we have to look at, okay, well, how can we accomplish both? How can we get incentivized transit-oriented development while still working with the community to identify what's important to them and what we could preserve while still allowing the development that we need to happen?
And so you're working on that. That's
yes.
a conflict.
I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution, but we are working on it.
Yeah, and I think we're going to dive into that question a little bit more as well. because I think this is a common issue. This is something I think a lot of communities are dealing with, that conflict between preserving, conserving what is there, allowing for increased density, in particular to provide more housing, hopefully more affordable housing. Who's caught in the middle? How do you balance that? Yeah, okay. Larry, how about you? Alignments and conflicts.
Sure. I'm going to share a screen here, just a quick slide from one
Great.
of our design presentations, essentially to show kind of some of the things that we might be dealing with at the city level. So I think both activities, preservation and planning need to be considered as like this overall city effort or community effort. In the case of most of our rural communities, they're very small, people are interconnected. And, it's important that, the community as well as the town comes together and offers like a full support for preservation activities. City staff often may not be completely aware of the benefits and treatments for historic properties. And some of the guiding documents, things like a preservation ordinance, using the correct building code, even zoning ordinances might not be that preservation friendly. So, it's really important to be comprehensive and look all the way across the board whenever we're establishing policies. And the great thing, though, is that it's not all on the planning office. In a smaller community, we actually have people that are engaged directly through the Main Street Board or volunteers that have these connections and friendships with people in local government as well. So that's how we can actually come together. And I think it's maybe sometimes a little easier in small towns. I mean, there are politics in every community, but the connectedness in a smaller community is great between the preservationists and the town governments, particularly in Main Street.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunity to look at some of these policies, some of which are basic zoning policies, and others are more specialized around historic preservation, historic districts, and make sure that they're in alignment. And perhaps part of that is just understanding those, so that everybody's on the same page, and maybe easier to do in a small town for sure. Shannon, how about you in San Antonio?
Sure. I mean, I have a slightly different view on it in general. Like I sort of reject the notion that there is a conflict between preservation and planning at all, because preservation is planning. And I mean, the fact that there's a urban design and preservation division of the APA, like it is planning.
Yeah.
And so the fact that different section, like different focuses or whatever word you want to use in the planning field don't always agree or align or communicate well, I think that's the issue. It's about kind of helping people understand that, but I think it's part of the problem that we allow that conversation to continue happening about us being at odds, because you can't be at odds with yourself. I mean, I guess you can, but
we're all planners.
Yeah. So like that's kind of where I come from. And but then I also think that it just kind of underscores the fact that we really because I've experienced a very similar situation when I was in Franklin, Tennessee, to what Sarah described about, sort of unintended consequences of well-meaning planning policies or comprehensive planning decisions or things like that. It certainly happens, but it's important to remember that, historic preservation is density. Like Place Economics and Don Ripkema have done study after study showing that our older and historic neighborhoods are dense. Often the most dense neighborhoods in our cities, but they're dense at a human scale. They're walkable. It is affordable housing. I mean, we just did a very extensive study here in San Antonio that affordable housing units are provided disproportionately by older and historic buildings, and by far. So like all of those sort of notions that we've allowed to perpetuate that there's a conflict with preservation and these other public goods, I just don't think are true if we really dig into it.
Okay, good. All right. Hopefully we can keep talking more about that. I think that's a great perspective. Thank you. Okay, well, let's pause here again and hear from the audience about some of this. Now you've heard from the panelists what they're seeing as the role of preservation in their communities and maybe some of the opportunities for collaboration and alignment, maybe some of the challenges. We want to hear from you about what are some of the big issues you are wrestling with in your communities. So if I could ask Christine to put up the second polling question, there we go. So tell us a little bit about some of the priorities in your community. You've got to pick one, so this is going to be tough.
Wow. I think I'm the only one that can see the results this far. So far, the answer is wow. There's a clear winner.
The answer is wow. Yeah.
I'm keeping you in suspense
I
on a
know.
Friday afternoon. That's what I do best.
Yeah.
It's also not surprising.
We
And
were going to have you rank them, but that didn't work with the system. So you had to make
No,
this
Zoom
tough
doesn't let you
call.
rank.
Yeah.
It's one or nothing.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna give it 3 more seconds. Okay, here we go.
It is aha. There you go.
Yeah, right. Not surprising.
No, it's really not. You know, I think I read somewhere that I think every state in the country has a lack of affordable housing to one degree or another, whether you're talking about California or Wyoming or Florida, and everything in between. So many communities struggling with this in one way or another. So let's talk about it. If I could ask our panelists to specifically address that issue of preservation's role when it comes to affordable housing. And Shannon kind of got us started here with the study that her department commissioned from Place Economics, looking at the fact that a lot of the existing affordable housing in San Antonio is in older buildings, the bungalows and small apartments and courtyard apartments and so on that are common there. So one thing I think I'd like to hear about is, what can preservation do to preservations and planners together do to conserve that existing affordable housing, but what can be done to add affordable housing? So I'm going to open the floor to our panelists. Shannon, if you want to add more, or Sarah or Larry, jump in.
Sure. I mean, yeah, so our opportunity at risk study is available on our website if anyone's interested. It's sapreservation.com, and you can easily find it from there. But it is like, yes, we looked not just at historic. We very deliberately looked at older and historic housing and the role that it plays. And it does, like, lower income, like below 80% AMI, are very significantly more likely to live in an older home than not. And so that is important. And so we know that we need to do what we can as a community to preserve that naturally occurring affordable housing, and then also reinvest in those properties rather than demolishing them. And I think that's true even of new affordable housing. Like we know that we are never going to be able to build our way out of an affordable housing crisis because it's just too expensive. It's not cost effective to be able to just think that we're going to produce all of those new units. Like we have to reinvest in the ones that are in our communities and that are deteriorating and try to arrest that deterioration. And so one of the other aspects of that in San Antonio is our Rehab-A-Rama program. We have done that. We've done it for many years with zero funding aside from volunteers and donations, but we've recently been given $500,000 as part of the affordable housing bond that was passed by the city. And the model is basically to work with owners, low-income owners that meet the threshold, and with volunteer contractors and volunteer teams. So we can pay for a portion of work done to the property, but we leverage those dollars by also utilizing volunteers and asking contractors to donate their overhead costs so they can pay their hard costs, but they're not necessarily making as much as they would otherwise. And that has been very successful. And another aspect of the program is that we utilize reuse existing material from our Material Innovation Center. And that is a way to keep city procurement costs down on affordable housing projects. And the beauty of that is that we're replacing with in-kind materials on these older and historic structures. And so we're also promoting the circular economy in our community at the same time. And so it ticks a lot of boxes that help with the affordable housing question, but also other challenges that our community is dealing with.
Great. So that's some real hands-on kind of help. Property owners to maintain, to repair existing housing that may be affordable. Okay. Larry, tell us a little bit about how housing is fitting into preservation practice in smaller communities, Main Street communities in Colorado.
Sure, you bet. Well, you know, we have a lot of vacant occupancy sometimes downtown, and that's really a function of buildings being passed down in recent generations, and they're not being local ownership a lot of times. Often it's also because there just isn't enough commercial business downtown, okay? So what we end up with are vacant upper floors more often than not, and then also the ground floors that aren't being fully utilized. And so what we've seen is, we'd like to advise, or we, pose as an option to a community, that they should look at mixed use ordinances and make sure that things are in place to actually be able to encourage, upper floor and or ground floor occupancy for residences. On a ground floor, you don't want to take away the sidewalk commercial space. So there's really been some studies that have been done locally with us that have shown that, even if you can just maintain maybe the first third of the depth of these, 100, 120 foot deep buildings, then you can actually, run an effective business. You don't need as much area for stock anymore. The train doesn't come once a month or whatever for your goods and wares. So the rear of these properties, a lot of times, as long as you have functional egress from the commercial space, potentially in two directions, if it's needed, you can put residences back there pretty effectively, particularly on like corner lots and things like that. We're seeing that in some communities. And I've actually been working on some plans with some property owners to remodel first floors for occupancy. Some communities really don't allow it. I'm not sure if that's a failure of really just holding on to the old practice that downtown should be mostly commercial. But if we're not fully utilizing the space, it makes sense to maybe do those kinds of studies and find out what kind of remaining vacant space we have. Upper floor redevelopment is something that Main Street's been about for a very long time. These spaces used to be for professional offices and boarding houses and things that really fell out of use, in the last century. So I think that, activating that, we've seen actually like DDAs give like a square foot bonus, in money, actually to support upper floor redevelopment, waiving fees, things like that, has been a very positive, given us some very positive outcomes in some of our communities. So, there are ways to encourage it. We have seen some things happen, but I think more needs to be done.
No, I think those are good examples, looking at where there is perhaps some hidden vacancy or underutilization and modernizing. It might be zoning codes to allow mixed use, residential uses. Building codes, I know, can be a challenge. So addressing those and try to find solutions there. And then I like your idea of incentivizing housing conversions of one sort or another. Sarah, I want to give you a chance to chime in as well. I know affordable housing is a big issue in South Florida. And you probably see a lot of different approaches there in the communities that you work with.
Yeah, it is. It's a big issue. So two things I wanted to bring up. One is we have our historic Little Havana neighborhood, and a few years back, the National Trust worked with some of our local planners to do a revitalization master plan study in that neighborhood, and it was very interesting because there's a lot of there's always a lot of talk in South Florida about density and that we have to build denser in order to get the capacity we need. But that study found that that neighborhood actually has a lot of capacity to accommodate new development in a sensitive way that fits the historic character of the neighborhood. So that was very interesting. And then also Miami-Dade County, the last few years has really been interested in preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. And so what we did, we're actually in our third fiscal year of providing $1 million to our local preservation nonprofit group to establish a historic preservation revolving fund for affordable housing. And what they are required to do with that money is to purchase historic housing stock that is either already locally designated or eligible to be locally designated. And they have to enter into a covenant with our public housing department and essentially have a covenant on the property saying that the property will be maintained as affordable housing for a minimum of 30 years. And actually, I'll share my screen for me because I'll show you a couple of those that they've done so far. So this is the first building that they bought. It's actually in Little Havana. And it's a fourplex that was built, I think, in the 30s. So this is when they first purchased it before they rehabbed it. And then let's see if I can get it. Sorry, it's not switching to the next photo. Sorry, hold on. And then here it is after they've done the rehab.
Nice.
So they did an exterior rehab. They rehabbed the apartments inside. And like I said, they I think they're maintaining all 4 of the units as affordable, which they don't have to do. I think they're required to do 1 of the units, but it'll be affordable housing for at least 30 years. And that's the first property that they purchased. They also purchased the second one, and then they're looking at a third property as well.
Thanks for sharing that example. Yeah, that's State Heritage Trust, right, Sarah?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, which is the nonprofit preservation group based in Miami. And, you know, I think we are seeing a number of the preservation organizations on the nonprofit side and then partnering with their city preservation programs to look at ways to add affordable housing into underused or vacant older buildings. It is an opportunity, and we need to take it further. Well, that's a big topic. Appreciate all of those examples. I know we could have a whole webinar on this one. Maybe we should. But let's move to another topic that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, and I know we're going to want to hear from Sarah about this one as well, and that's climate change. So if I could ask Christine again to put up our third and final polling question. This one is focused on climate. Okay, here we're looking to hear from you all about how climate change is affecting your community, and you can select any or all that are happening in your community, both the impacts and perhaps some of the response to climate impacts.
All right. I'm going to give it 3 more seconds. Okay. I'm going to end it now. More coming in. Hold on. I just got like 20 more. Okay. We got to stop it at some point. All right. I'm stopping it. Here we go.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Okay, well, let's touch on a couple of these if we could. The 2 that got the most response had to do with sea level rise and flood risk. So Sarah, I'm probably going to ask you to talk about that one. And then the other was on solar and other kinds of ways to retrofit existing buildings. And I just want you to think a little bit about what we can do to accelerate the retrofitting of our existing older and historic building stock. So maybe Shannon or Larry, each of you could chime in on that one. So Sarah, if you're ready, tell us a little bit about South Florida and sea level rise and flooding. We often look to you all to see the future.
Yes. Yeah. So sea level rise related flooding is not even really a future concern. It's in Miami. It's a right now concern. We get a lot of flooding, even on sunny days. We'll get flooding depending on the tides. We can get extreme seasonal high tides, and those cause flooding. So yeah, it's a pressing issue that we're looking at right now. And so we have something down here called the Southeast Florida Climate Change Regional Compact. So that's a compact that the Miami-Dade County and a few of the other neighboring counties are a part of. And it lists out specific goals and things that we want to do related to climate change. And one of the goals in it says that the goal is to preserve historic and archaeological resources and increase resource resilience by implementing best practices for the identification, evaluation, and prioritization of threatened resources using adaptive preservation strategies. So that's our overarching goal that we're working towards. The Office of Historic Preservation, our first step towards that was to complete a historic site vulnerability assessment, which basically created an objective matrix to assess how vulnerable all our designated sites are to sea level rise and flooding. And, once we kind of understand how sites are at varying levels of risks, then we can start to look at kind of next steps and how to prioritize. Our vulnerability assessment did have a series of recommendations that dealt with, looking at policy integration to deal with resilience, looking at studying historic construction materials and the resilience of those, and looking at, pilot projects. What is like a county historic site that's very vulnerable that we could use for a pilot project, which we're actually doing right now with grant funding at the Deering Estate and with University of Florida to do some 3D scanning and modeling to show like what the flooding will look like there. So, I mean, I don't necessarily have like the perfect solution. I mean, we're still trying to kind of wrap our heads around everything. I mean, the reality is, especially in a place like Miami, that the water is coming and you can't save everything.
Yeah.
There's just no way that you're going to save everything. So you have to start to look at, yes, all of these things are significant, but how do we start to prioritize what we're going to do with things that are going to be lost to flooding? And that's where, technology and documentation starts to become very important.
And have you been seeing elevations of the older buildings as a response?
Yeah, we've seen some of that in Miami Beach. You'll see individual property owners raise up their building. To me, that's good for that one property, but to me, that's not a great kind of comprehensive response, because it's like, okay, that one building is saved, but what could we do kind of more widespread?
Yeah, so Larry and Shannon, ask you to chime in on this and from what you're seeing. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about solar and heat pumps and retrofitting of existing buildings to reduce carbon emissions from our existing building stock. But before we get to that, I just want to follow on the question we asked of Sarah about resilience planning. And this is a challenge that doesn't work. The response can't be building by building. We've got to think more comprehensively and be part of larger strategies and solutions. Is there anything that you can point to in your community where preservation is part of larger planning responses to the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, one example, we were very involved in the creation of our council adopted climate action and adaptation plan. And an aspect of that plan is that we are charged with creating a climate heritage strategic plan, which we're still in the process of developing. So I don't have any like perfect solutions yet, but also very like culture and cultural heritage is a specifically called out aspect or component of the equity evaluation process that is required to take place as part of our climate action plans, like kind of evaluating strategies for and interventions, which I think is really important. And I think another aspect that is tied to climate and to the climate response is like the whole concept of kind of local material sourcing and local green jobs. Another thing that we're very actively involved in is trades education through our Living Heritage Trades Academy. And I think that's another thing that's really important. You know, we talk about reinvesting in the existing built environment, but if we don't have people that are skilled to do that and the materials that are needed to do that, then those create problems. And when we're sourcing materials from who knows where, that is a climate impact. And so, you know, really helping people understand that there is real, like Carl Elefante's famous quote, the greenest building is one that's already built. It, you know, there's so much truth to that. And we, you know, like we are part of the solution as preservationists. And I think we need to believe that sometimes.
Yeah, I know you've touched on a number of things there, but that last piece, you know, the role of preservation as stewards of existing buildings, and not only that, the materials that go into them, and thinking about how we can avoid the need to replace those materials either through a rehab or through new construction, and being really thoughtful about that. And you guys have been real leaders there in San Antonio.
Well, and also in terms of community resilience, you know, so much about how a community having a sense of place and a sense of community, and learning about, you know, traditional knowledge and all those types of things that had historically responded to the environment, I think is another really important aspect that culture and heritage plays in climate response.
Right, in indigenous communities that have a lot to share in the way of making places more resilient to these kinds of impacts that we can learn from. Yeah. Larry, maybe I can ask you to talk a little bit about this question of how to retrofit older buildings to reduce carbon emissions from our buildings. It sounded like that was something that many communities are looking at, and you've been doing some innovative work there.
We have over the last, I would say, almost going on probably 3 years, we've seen that there is interest, especially, you know, here in Colorado, there's a lot of interest in, you know, reducing energy expenses. You know, we've seen through the federal government recently, we have a 30% tax credit now for solar, which is fantastic. That's pretty much for anyone that wants to install it, local governments included. We've developed something called the Heritage Energy Approach. This is something that came about as a result of just saying to official, you know, people in at History Colorado and at the Colorado Energy Office, hey, why don't we start to collaborate a little bit on projects? We actually had a pilot grant program called Main Street Open for Business over the last year, just concluded June 30th in 2022. And we funded over 100 projects in 16 communities. The things that actually the funding would allow would be facade improvements and or energy conservation measures that they could take, you know, new HVAC, you know, solar on the roof, better doors and windows when appropriate, things like that. The approach essentially pulls together folks from both offices to work together with us at the Department of Local Affairs so that we can actually expedite processes, which we saw during this program. We also just feel that we can work better together. We formed kind of a small group and we meet regularly. We have projects that are already net zero after this program. These are the solar projects particularly, which is interesting. And it's even better considering there was only a 20% match for the funding on this work. So, you know, these owners are doing very well, buildings that are net zero. I just want to mention something about there's challenges too in Colorado. We have 4 different distinct climate zones here. And it, you know, that poses some issues. And also in our study, as we continue the heritage energy work, we're looking for solutions that are sort of ready-made, you know, a process or a solution to Here's the best, roof insulation levels. Here's the type of heating and cooling system that you may need in your building to your climate zone. Air sealing is a big thing that you need to take care of with these old buildings. And you can do that a lot of times very well with insulating roof decks and sealing as you insulate. A lot of times the side walls are not exposed on these Main Street buildings. So there's already a benefit there of having minimal exposure to the natural environment. We're going to continue with the work, looking for more grant funding to do energy retrofits and analysis, looking for return on investment figures for different energy upgrade measures. One thing that we've been really just starting to think about recently is with historic structure assessments that would be, usually funded out of this state office, the State Historical Fund in Colorado. We're thinking that maybe if we actually included energy audits in an HSA, that could be a really positive step towards, leading towards climate change through preservation work directly, because then we're going to, notice the shortfalls in particular problems, because they're all different, every building. And then we could address those through other state grant, funding measures through this preservation office that are available, as well as energy office grants that are really just going out the door like daily nowadays with all the federal government investment.
Well, I think, yeah, integrating those questions about how to make our older buildings more energy efficient, integrating that question into everything we're doing. Every time we're thinking about a project and investing in an older building, we need to make sure we're paying attention to the impacts on carbon emissions. And Larry, I'm sure one of the things you mentioned is return on investment, and of course this kind of work can really pay off for a property owner as well, saving operational energy and reducing emissions from operations, but also saving money.
I'll just throw one more thing in there that breaking down the stigma that essentially you can't have both. That's essentially where we were originally going with this, is that you can have good, responsible energy efficiency upgrades to a building that also aligns with preservation standards. I mean, we can't do everything in these buildings. We can't insulate walls sometimes and things like that. So the idea is quality preservation and then doing as much as we can. And there's a lot you can do.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. Could I have just one more thing on the question about kind of interventions, like new interventions or solar like that. We're kind of in an interesting situation in Texas because in the state legislature last session, we're no longer allowed to regulate solar panels, which I personally think is great. Like one less thing for us to fight about, and I don't feel like I need to stand in the way of that, as a preservationist. So I think that it really is time for preservation as a movement to critically look at our kind of more traditional, older, longstanding design guidelines and things like that, and really think about letting go of some of the preciousness associated with historic preservation and design review. I still love historic windows. I'm not necessarily ready to throw all those out, but I do think that there's a middle ground that we all need to find in terms of design review, so that we're being realistic about the issues that our communities are facing.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, and that comment, reminds me that is the case in Texas, I think California as well. I don't believe that, if I'm remembering right, local commissions regulate solar, do design review on solar installations as well. They just provide some general guidance. And I think there may be other states as well. And this is the kind of thing that's going to be coming one way or the other. Anybody else want to comment on that? Since it's often an issue that gets debated. No? Okay. Very good. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and we're going to pivot here to the questions from those who are listening in, and there have been some good ones coming in already. Add to them, and Christine will sort through, and we'll get to some of those. But let me just close by asking each of you, if you would, to share what you think might be a common misimpression about historic preservation. Anybody want to start?
Oh, I'll jump in. And this is really building off of what Shannon said before. But I think the biggest misconception, and it's a misconception that even some preservation professionals have, is that historic preservation and the goals of historic preservation are insular. So the reality is historic preservation in and of itself is not a profession. Okay, so everyone think about that for a second. Historic preservation in and of itself is not a profession. Rather, it is an essential part of every profession that deals with the built environment. That's why it's essential for us to stop working in a silo, stop what I often refer to as preservation for preservation's sake, get involved with your local planning and your local zoning and development services folks, and really integrate into what they're doing, become a part of the conversation.
Thank you. So integrate, don't stand alone. Good.
And
Right.
everyone will benefit, really. The preservation work will benefit, the planning and the development and growth will benefit from that, from understanding the land use history and understanding what's important to the community. Everyone's work is going to benefit.
Thank you.
I can jump in there. I think something, preservation is seen as a roadblock a lot of times, especially we have a strong property rights state. And that's kind of the way people feel, is that really government shouldn't regulate what they do with their properties. They don't often see the value and the benefit of preservation. So I think what could happen would be like a local, the local planning office sort of leading folks through that maybe in a little more tactful way. We do have design review here. It's a lot of times we don't actually. Most often we don't. And in the towns we do, leading through in a sensitive way, connecting folks with the Main Street program, which usually has individuals that know a lot about historic preservation in those types of buildings, particularly. And then also with us at the state level, that can connect us directly. So I think it is, again, about working together locally so that things aren't seen as a roadblock. And that may be a problem everywhere, though. I'm not sure. Folks thinking it takes too much time, takes too much effort. I don't know where to start. I don't know anything about tax credits, and so it is a lot about education as well.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Argument for being proactive about sharing what preservation is about. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would agree with both Sarah and Larry, of course. And I think where there's sometimes a thought that we're a roadblock, or whatever word you want to use, or there's a trade-off between development and preservation. You hear that a lot, and I also fully reject that notion. Like, preservation is development, and you can't do preservation without developers. Like, we need people that are willing to invest their money and do projects in our communities. And if they have a preservation component, then that's wonderful. And I think, we know, even just anecdotally, that development projects that have a preservation component are often better and more valuable in the long run, because they're more interesting. And that's where people want to travel and visit and vacation and all of those things. So I think that's another kind of related misconception to what both Sarah and Larry raised.
Yeah, the word preservation doesn't sound like development, does it? But in fact, that is a big part of the work, and I know you all are involved in that. And I'll just mention, we brought up a lot of topics here. Brad mentioned our website, and actually the best way to get our National Trust website is savingplaces.org, and you'll find information there on a range of preservation topics, upcoming conferences, educational programs, but also resources and examples. And one that just comes to mind is on state and federal tax credits, which are a tool that a lot of developers use to do that preservation-based development. And Texas has a great state tax credit now that is exciting to see the impact of that. So hopefully you can find your way to those kinds of resources if you're interested. All right, well, Christine, tell us, give us some more questions from our audience. We're curious.
Man, these are good questions.
Good ones, yeah, great.
All right, I'm gonna just bring us down a notch here.
Good.
And thinking about the typical audience that we see here, you know, we've got a lot of planners and everyone is stretched thin in terms of their capacity, in terms of their funding. So let's say someone is coming onto this webinar being in that 0 to 10% range in terms of working with historic preservation, and a planner who has a staff of themselves, or like maybe one other person goes, well, I'm sure there's historic structures. I know there's historic structures in our town. Nothing is officially on, you know, the register or anything. Where do I start? What do I catalog them? Like, do I reach out to the owners? Like, are they in good shape? Are they not? You know, are they an added benefit or are they a detriment? Like, where do we start?
I can jump on that one. I think really you have to start identifying what those resources are and how they're unique to your community. You can reach out directly to your state preservation office. I know Texas has a good one, and also your state Main Street program. Texas also has a very good Main Street program. And those are the two groups that actually could help you get the ball rolling to see, you know, how do I set up a designation? How do I set up designation? You know, working, for example, through a certified local government structure. Which is part of preservation. It doesn't sound like it, but it's about developing an ethic in your community. And you can get grants that are really no match to develop things like surveys and preservation plans and things like that. In a small community, though, it can be managed rather easily. You can actually set up a local ordinance to be able to establish some local review and designation as a process. And that's a great place to start. In Colorado, we only require local designation to receive the state tax credit. So it's, you know, as long as you have something official, then you can go after those resources too. But yeah, start with the upper level organizations and then see what they advise.
Anyone else?
Okay. Oh, we got plenty more questions. Don't you worry. This next one. So how do we deal with the folks, whether they be the community members or our elected officials, decision makers that aren't in it in terms of historic preservation, that don't find the value, aren't interested, have the misconceptions, you know, that they're way inefficient, that they cost too much money and they're just not worth it? What do we do with them? What do we say to them? How do we convince them?
I mean, I think bottom line, number one, there's always going to be somebody you're never going to convince. So, you know, I mean, they're like, it is what it is. We have to agree to disagree. But I think the answer for the vast majority of people is to try to speak to them where they are. If it is, you know, depending on their perspective, if they're, you know, if it's a political issue, if it's a, you know, whatever it is, like speak to them in, you know, like where it speaks to their perspective, and taking different approaches. Like I mentioned that we have very extensive education and outreach efforts, and it's like thinking about it in lots of different ways. Like we just hosted an event last week called the Amazing Preservation Race, where people raced all over downtown and did silly things, but they learned about our downtown at the same time. They got some exercise, they had fun. And now all of a sudden, we're not just the scary office that tells them what they can and can't do with their property. We're exposing them to new things. Education of children talk to their parents, children make their parents go places. You know, I mean, it's just, I think you just have to be creative in thinking about how to reach people in different ways.
Anyone else have some wise wisdom on the politics of historic preservation? No one wants to go there. Okay. I'm gonna go into a couple specific questions next. And the first one is gonna go to you, Shannon. There were several questions coming in wanting to know more about the trades program.
Okay, sure. So we have been involved for many years, since probably 2008 or 9. in trades education, specifically wood window repair. That's kind of where we started. And we really thought early on that that was going to be a way for contractors to come and learn how to fix windows and then use it as a marketing opportunity. And that's not what happened initially. It was more DIY people, which is also great. But eventually we have seen a number of window repair businesses come out of our window repair education. So we kind of took that concept and expanded it as part of the City of San Antonio's Ready to Work initiative, which is basically workforce development initiative. And we work with a local nonprofit workforce development partner. And we host an actual Living Heritage, it's called the Living Heritage Trades Academy, where people come for a 1 week kind of intensive training class with a master craftsman. Sometimes it's windows, sometimes it's general preservation carpentry, but those types of skills. And then they are placed for 10 weeks in a paid apprenticeship. And it also, through our partner, comes with wraparound services like financial counseling and childcare support and those types of things that sometimes people need when trying to get back into the workforce. And also OSHA certification and all those types of things that mean at the end of the 10-week apprenticeship, if they did a good job, they might be hired on the spot. But if they're not hired by their host contractor, then they're ready to go to work in the field the next day. And that is important from the preservation perspective, because we need people who can work on our older and historic building stock. And we know in Texas and across the country that skilled craftsmen are, they're a significant proportion, over half are 45 years or older, which means that their retirements are looming and they're not being replaced at the same rate. And so when we don't have the craftsmen, then that means the work is even more expensive. And so then preservation becomes even more cost prohibitive. And so it's a vicious cycle. And that's really what we're trying to address. And I'll stop there, but I'm happy to, offline talk to anybody more about those initiatives.
Great. Thank you. I love this next question. There are a few things that I love talking about right now, and one of them is ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And you want to talk about a way in which to assist with just the housing crisis in general, and the idea of aging in place and multi-generational housing, just all the things related to ADUs. How do we incorporate good ADU practices in historic areas?
So I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I'll jump in really quickly.
Go for it.
So I agree with you. I think they're very important. And one of the initiatives that we have started here is what we call Salvage to ADU initiative. And so we're taking the materials that are coming out as a result of our deconstruction projects. And then we're working with an architect to develop a pattern book for historic neighborhood appropriate ADU designs that are constructed fully out of salvage material. And so the idea is it'll be sort of like a old-fashioned Sears kit house where you could just buy the whole thing and it'll all be pre-permitted and approved. And so it'll be very easy for somebody to take that and put it into the neighborhood. And a very basic historically appropriate kind of proportioned ADU is something that could fit into most, if not all, of our existing local historic districts.
Sure, I feel like ADUs are something that's important, especially in the ring around, historic downtown areas like in Main Street areas. Recently in a community, the town owns some property that they wanted developed into single family homes, and they were going to split these lots up. On the back side, on the alley side of one of these was a historic mining shack or a miner's residence. It was a very small building, like 500 square feet or something. But the town's decided to keep that as part of the project, and that particular lot would actually have that as an ADU. It needs a lot of work, but then also with that we felt that having the option of building an ADU with new development would be something that the town could entertain pretty much anywhere, as long as they, got the approval, town council. That would be a smart practice, I think. And in new developments, there may be even a way to run some utilities or services to a particular place, given that the owner or the buyer of the property would potentially want one in the future. They would also be able to opt out and say, I don't think I want that, but explaining about, rental income and things that are the benefits to this, or a mother-in-law, mother-in-law suites, a lot of people think of them that way. Family members, people that visit, really important in our mountain town economy as well, because there's a lot of affordable housing needed.
Great. And just taking a break real quick, if you look in the chat box to all my attendees, you aren't able to use the chat box, you just have the Q&A. But if you look, there are all kinds of links that I've been posting in there. So be sure to copy those over if you're interested in any of these topics. And really quick, I just need to take my own little poll. Can you use the raise hand function if you're more on the historic preservation side than the planning side? I just want to make sure that I gear the rest of our time appropriately. So again, raise your hand if you're more on the historic preservation side. I want to make sure that I explain things if I need to put some context into our weird planning lingo that we have. Okay, thank you. And Shannon, you have a question? Oh, I see. Never mind. I'm on page now. All right, let's scroll back up here. The next question is interesting. It's about insurance. The question says, that older buildings tend to be harder to insure if you're a developer, or even if you're a city trying to purchase a building. And also if it's on the National Register, insurance companies might not even want to insure the building. I don't know if that's true or not, but if you could talk a little bit about that as a barrier for either a community to invest in historic buildings or for developers to invest in historic buildings, and what we can do to try to get around some of that.
So we haven't really run into that issue that much, but I will say, Jim, and I'm making a plug for the National Trust, but whatever the National Trust, what is it called? National Trust Insurance
Services. Yeah, National Trust Insurance Services. If you're dealing with this issue, that's a good resource.
Super helpful.
They can help connect you to those who know how to work with insurance in historic buildings. Part of this is just having the knowledge and experience.
Yeah, we had a couple of quirky situations where we formed a sister nonprofit organization called the Power of Preservation Foundation, and we own a property and we lease a property in order to save both. And both were vacant and being used as learning labs for our trades academy. And so just like a weird situation. And the National Trust Insurance people figured it all out. Easy peasy.
Okay, we're going to talk about equity for a few minutes. And this first one, Sarah, I'm intrigued by the combination of a vulnerability assessment and focus on preservation sites. However, historic preservation has generally suffered from whiteness. Did you look at equity and diversity when prioritizing your most vulnerable sites? Or was it purely focused on sites with the most risk to the effects of sea level rise?
Okay, that's a great question. And when I talk to people about the work we do in our office, I always tell people the two big things that we focus on are resilience and equity. And so the vulnerability assessment really was focused on just like an objective way to see how vulnerable sites are to sea level rise without taking into account, the heritage or the communities that they're associated with. That being said, I also want to say that, in Miami-Dade, we recognize that preservation, like I kind of said before, is one tool that we can use to help uplift our residents and make their communities more equitable and more resilient. So, one approach that we're taking right now is to try to identify more resources related to our historically excluded communities. So like right now, we're doing the first countywide heritage resource survey that the county has undertaken since 1980. We have about 200,000 structures that need to be surveyed. So we're doing the first phase right now. And how we decided to prioritize that work was to focus it in neighborhoods that are dealing with the planning challenges that I spoke about before. So like redevelopment pressure, housing affordability, climate change, and then also identifying resources that are related to our historically excluded communities. We did a data audit on our designated sites a few years ago, and we found that the vast majority of our designations are related to wealthy white males. No surprise, that matches the national trends. And the vast majority of our designations relate to architecture. It's because the architecture is significant. Well, you know, we really have to start to look at, you know, the overall impact that the last century of systemic racism implemented by local planning and zoning agencies and also by local preservation agencies has had on our communities. So simply identifying the resources and then designating more resources is really not enough. You really have to also look at the regulatory function of your designations. How can that be used to help property owners meet their preservation goals? So for example, our ordinance in Miami-Dade puts us at a good advantage. In our ordinance, you have to meet one of our eligibility criteria. A lot of local governments, maybe you have to meet 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 7 or whatever. Ours, you have to meet one criteria. And we also have a criteria that allows for properties to be designated based solely on cultural or social significance. It doesn't have to have any kind of architectural significance whatsoever. So we're starting to look at that more and expand our designations based on that. And then, you know, it's really important to continually ask yourself, why are you doing the work that you're doing? How does it help the community meet their goals? And I'm just going to show one example really quick. I'll show a photo. Okay, this is the Liberty City Elks Lodge. And this was designated in 2021 at the request of the Liberty City Elks organization. It's a historically African-American fraternal organization, and the designation is based, you may be able to tell from the photo, it is not based on the architecture of the building. It is based on the cultural and social significance of the organization. And when they approached us, and people always ask when they're interested in designation, what effect will this have on the property going forward? So they approached us and asked us that, and we kind of explained the regulatory, you know, the typical regulatory approach on how things would be regulated, and that really didn't work with their goals. So when we looked at the building, and let me, if I can bring up a historic photo really quick. This is a 1970s photo. So there's been changes to the building over time. The windows and things have changed. And the Elks Lodge really was not interested in being regulated to that level, didn't help them meet their goals. So what we did when we proposed this to the preservation board, we said, well, we're proposing this for designation. But when it comes to regulatory, when it comes to what we're going to require a certificate of appropriateness for, it's very little, very, very little. So let me see if I can just go back really quickly to the other photo to show you. So basically, we defined some character defining features that are going to be regulated. It's basically this entry area. So the brick, the extruded stucco banding, the stone that you see here on the corner, the eyebrow over the entry door. That's basically it. So we said, we're not regulating windows. We're not regulating doors. If they want to go blast a giant door in where there was never a door on the front facade of this building, they can do that with no approval from us. We're fine with that. They can put on a new roof. They can change the paint color. Basically, if they want to change the character defining features, they have to come to us, or if they're going to change the overall massing of the structure, meaning if they want to demolish it or they want to build an addition, then they have to get the approval from us. Otherwise, they don't need it from us. And when we presented it to our board, the board was really like, oh, this is really different. They weren't used to this approach to regulation, but they ended up approving it unanimously. They understood that it's helping preserve the site, it's helping tell the story of Liberty City and the Elks Lodge, and it's helping the lodge members themselves meet their goals. Will still be able to use the building in the way that they want. So I think we have to start to think about our regulatory function, and it doesn't have to look the way it's always looked. And that's okay. We don't have to regulate things so stringent. And I'm sorry, because that was really long, but that was my very long soapbox about equity and historic preservation.
Super important.
Very important.
Anyone else have any comments on and honestly, I don't know, I sort of feel like anymore, a lot of historic preservation, at least that I've seen, plans really have like a whole component just on equity alone. And that's really great to see. So I think there's a lot of really good examples out there too, if you're thinking about that.
Yeah, you know, I would just kind of make a plug for the city of Austin. The city of Austin, Kara Bertrand in Austin has been leading their equity preservation plan effort for the last, I don't know, year or more. And it's very impressive. Like there's a whole website and all of the stuff that they've been doing, working with the community. And I would definitely recommend checking that out.
Okay, I'm hoping we can squeeze in 2 more questions. The first one is how do we incorporate historic preservation with transportation needs, with transit-oriented development, or TODs, if you've heard of that? How do we make sure that they can flow together nicely, but we can, we also make sure that we can meet the demands of transportation needs? Anyone? You're all thinking? All right.
I don't know if Sarah, if that's an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the first project I think you mentioned early in our discussion about, transit corridors densifying. Would that relate?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Christine, ask the question again in full.
Just looking at the nexus between historic preservation and TODs.
Oh,
Or not even simpler than that, just accessible transportation in general.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're in conflict with each other, certainly. I mean, I think there's the opportunities there, like I said, to look at like policy integration and how to make those things work together. Like I said, at the county, we have a lot of incentivized upzoning around our transit corridors. And I think, we just kind of have to put more thought into like, okay, well, how can that work with historic preservation? And that's part of the survey work that we're doing too, honestly. Like I said, that's a big focus, is those transit corridors, for us to say, okay, well, if you're going to incentivize all this upzoning, first, let's understand what are the historic resources that are there, and what is there that we could try to balance with new development around all the transit centers.
And then really quickly, my second question to this, also related to zoning, for those of us that are in the zoning world and we're looking at our ordinances right now, is there anything specific we should be looking for, specifically in terms of equity? So for example, if you have a historic district that is residential and right now it's zoned purely single family, are these things that we should be thinking about? That's just an example. I'm sure there are many others. But what are the big things that we should be looking for to ensure that as we look to preserve our communities, we're doing it through an equity lens?
I'd say the biggest thing is to talk to the community members. I mean, you have to understand, sorry, tiny assistant, so I'm happy. You have to understand what's important to them. I mean, we have, historic preservation has this history of like education. We have to go out in the community and tell them what's important to them and why it's important. And that's really backwards. I mean, we need them to tell us what's important to them, and then we can see how we can help them retain those resources. So that's, to me, that's the most critical first step, is community engagement.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say the exact same thing. Well said.
All right. Any final thoughts from anyone before I give my last little spiel of reminders? This was fun. You all are a wealth of knowledge, and Sarah's a super mama. I understand what it's like juggling all that. A couple quick reminders. If you want to view the first part of this two-part series here, the link is to view that video is over in the chat, and we are getting that approved for on-demand CM credit. So that will incentivize you to go watch the first part and get CM credits. You'll be able to find all that info. If you go to ohioplanning.org/on-demand, is probably on Monday is where you'll be able to get information to log that. Don't forget to log your CM credits for today's session, and we'll have the recording up sometime probably also on Monday on our website. You can register for all of our future webcasts at ohioplanning.org/planning webcasts. And I thank you all for joining us. We had a really big, great group, tons of wonderful questions. Clearly, we need to have you all back because we're just not done talking about this. So thanks to all of you and the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and of course, National Trust for Historic Preservation. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.